The mail-order bride stood alone, her dreams of love shattered by the cruel reality that awaited her in a foreign land. No one seemed to want her, until a small voice changed everything when a little girl tugged at her dress and whispered those life-altering words, "Can you be my mommy?" Sometimes the family we need finds us in the most unexpected ways. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The autumn wind swept across the dusty platform in Billings, Montana, as Mary Johnson stood alone, her gloved hands trembling around a battered carpet bag. The last train whistle faded into the distance, leaving behind a cloud of steam that dissipated into the crisp air. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, scanning the faces of strangers for someone, anyone, who might be looking for her. "Robert Smith," she whispered to herself, the name feeling hollow on her lips. Mary had memorized his letters, each one promising a new beginning, a home where her mixed heritage wouldn't matter. The daughter of a Pawnee woman and a white soldier, she had never truly belonged anywhere. This was supposed to be different. As minutes stretched into an hour, the platform gradually emptied. Families reunited with warm embraces, merchants welcomed weary travelers, and porters loaded the last of the luggage onto waiting wagons. No one spared a second glance for the slender woman whose hopeful expression had slowly crumbled into resignation. Mary unfolded the letter once more, her fingers tracing over the words that had given her courage to leave everything behind. "I will be waiting at the station," it read. "You'll recognize me by the blue handkerchief in my pocket." She had searched every man's coat, finding no such token, no waiting suitor. The station master approached, his boots heavy on the wooden planks. "Ma'am, last train's gone for today. You waiting on someone?" She straightened her back, dignity being all she had left. "It appears they're not coming," she replied, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "Town's got a boarding house 3 blocks down," he offered, pointing vaguely before returning to his duties. Mary sat on a hard bench, placing her carpet bag beside her. Inside were her few possessions, a change of clothes, her mother's beaded necklace, and savings that would last perhaps 2 weeks. The weight of her situation pressed down on her shoulders like a stone. This wasn't the first time she'd been left waiting, wasn't the first promise broken. The bookkeeper from Omaha, as her former employer had called her, had once again reached for something beyond her grasp. The cooling afternoon air carried laughter from somewhere nearby, perhaps from the saloon across the street where men gathered to share tales and mockery. Mary Johnson, 32 years old and twice left at the altar, sat perfectly still as shadows lengthened across the platform. She was invisible now, as she had always been, a woman caught between two worlds, belonging to neither, left behind once again. 2 young men snickered nearby, their laughter sharp as knives. Mary Johnson could feel their eyes on her back as she sat alone on the station bench. One nudged the other, not bothering to lower his voice. "There's the bookkeeper who thought she could marry a rancher," one jeered, his words carrying easily across the nearly empty platform. "Heard she's half Indian," the other replied with a smirk. "No wonder Smith didn't show. Probably got a good look at her and changed his mind." Mary clutched her carpet bag tighter, her knuckles whitening beneath her worn gloves. The cruel gossip wasn't new. It had followed her like a shadow through every town she'd ever lived in. She tried to steady her breathing, focusing on the distant mountains rather than the burning humiliation spreading across her cheeks. Rejection was a familiar companion. Twice she'd stood in borrowed finery, waiting for men who never arrived at the altar. The first had discovered her heritage the night before the wedding. The second simply found someone more suitable. The daughter of a Pawnee woman and a white soldier, Mary had never truly belonged anywhere. Her father's people viewed her with suspicion, while her mother's tribe had been scattered to reservations she'd never seen. A gust of autumn wind swept across the platform, carrying dust and the scent of pine. Mary pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, remembering her mother. Third time's not the charm for her kind. Mary blinked back tears, her throat tight with unspoken words. She was 32 years old, and the prospect of spending the rest of her life alone stretched before her like the endless Montana plains. She'd told herself she was used to being unwanted, had even convinced herself she preferred solitude to false kindness. But today, the ache felt raw and fresh. The letter had seemed so genuine, so full of promise. Robert Smith had written of needing a partner, not just a wife, someone who could keep books and help build a life. For the first time in years, Mary had allowed herself to hope. Now, as the sun dipped lower behind the station house and the young men finally moved on, she sat alone with her battered bag and wounded pride, wondering where she would sleep tonight and whether anyone would ever truly see her. Mary Johnson sat alone, tears streaming silently down her face as the autumn wind whipped around the train station. Her shoulders trembled with each suppressed sob, the weight of rejection pressing down on her like a physical burden. The worn carpet bag at her feet contained everything she owned, a pitiful collection for a woman who had traveled so far on nothing but false promises. As she wept, the soft tap of small boots against wooden planks approached. Mary looked up through tear-blurred vision to see a little girl standing before her. The child couldn't have been more than 3 years old, drowning in a coat several sizes too large. Her mittens dangled precariously from a frayed string threaded through her sleeves, and her wide, solemn eyes studied Mary with unabashed curiosity. "Are you hurt?" the little girl asked, her voice clear and direct in the way only children can manage. There was no judgment in her tone, only genuine concern that pierced straight through Mary's defenses. Mary hastily wiped her cheeks with gloved hands, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable state. She struggled to find her voice, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Just a little sad," she finally managed, the words coming out hoarse and unsteady. The child didn't retreat as most would. Instead, she stepped closer, her head tilting slightly as she continued her assessment. Her dark hair peeked out from beneath a knitted cap, reminding Mary painfully of her own mixed heritage, the Pawnee blood that had marked her as different her entire life. "My papa gets sad sometimes too," the girl offered, her mittened hand reaching out to touch Mary's skirt. "He sits by the fire and doesn't talk." Mary felt a strange connection to this solemn child, who spoke with such innocent wisdom. For a moment, the crushing loneliness eased as the little girl continued to study her with those penetrating eyes. There was something in that gaze, something that made Mary feel truly seen, for perhaps the first time since arriving in Billings. "I'm Lily," the child announced suddenly, as if deciding Mary was worthy of an introduction. "I'm Mary," she replied, her voice growing steadier as she spoke to the little girl. Lily nodded seriously, as if confirming something important to herself. She reached up and patted Mary's hand with unexpected gentleness. "Don't be sad," she instructed, her face a picture of earnest concern. "The wind makes everything better." As if to prove her point, a gust swept across the platform, lifting Mary's hair and bringing with it the scent of pine and earth. For a brief moment, Mary felt something stir within her. Not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. "Did your daddy say no?" the little girl pressed, her curiosity gentle but insistent. Her wide eyes studied Mary Johnson's face with that unfiltered honesty only children possess. Mary shook her head, trying to summon a smile that wouldn't quite form. "No, sweetheart, I don't think he ever existed." She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, embarrassed to be crying in front of the child. The girl tilted her head, her mittens dangling from a frayed string threaded through her coat sleeves. The woolen garment engulfed her tiny frame, clearly handed down from someone much larger. "Why are you all alone?" she asked, her voice small but clear against the emptying platform's ambient noise. "Sometimes that's just how life turns out," Mary answered, tucking the disappointing letter into her pocket. The paper felt like a physical reminder of her foolishness, believing that someone might actually want her. The child wasn't satisfied. She edged closer, her boots scuffing against the wooden planks. "Do you have a husband?" she inquired, her breath visible in the autumn chill. "No," Mary whispered, the single word carrying the weight of 2 broken engagements and countless rejections. "Do you have a baby?" The questions continued, each one a small knife twisting in Mary's heart. She swallowed hard, feeling the familiar ache of emptiness. As a woman of mixed heritage, she'd always existed between worlds, not fully accepted by either. The bookkeeper had spent years building walls around her heart, but somehow this small child was finding every crack. "Nobody wants me," Mary admitted softly, her voice cracking on the last word. The truth of it hung in the Montana air, stark and painful. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then the little girl did something unexpected. She reached forward with her mittened hand and pressed it against Mary's gloved fingers. The touch was gentle but determined, a tiny gesture of connection that somehow felt monumental. "Can you be my mommy forever?" the child asked, her eyes reflecting a loneliness that mirrored Mary's own. The question stole Mary's breath. In all her years of rejection, being left at the altar, whispered about for her Pawnee heritage, dismissed as unworthy, no one had ever simply chosen her. Yet here was this small stranger, offering what Mary had always yearned for: belonging. Before she could respond, before she could even process the surge of emotion flooding her chest, the little girl's mittened hand squeezed her fingers, as if sealing a promise between them that neither had the authority to make. The world stilled at the child's innocent question. Mary's heart thudded against her ribs, each beat echoing in her ears as she stared into those hopeful eyes. The platform around them seemed to fade away. The jeering men, the bustling travelers, even the sting of rejection, all vanished in the wake of those simple words. Before Mary could find her voice, a deep call cut through the moment. Lily. The name hung in the air, spoken with quiet authority and tinged with the weariness that comes from years of hardship. Mary Johnson turned to see a man approaching with measured steps. Broad-shouldered and tall, he moved with the deliberate gait of someone accustomed to hard labor. His eyes, though tired, remained watchful and clear beneath the brim of a worn hat. A patched coat hugged his frame, bearing the marks of numerous mends and careful preservation. In one hand, he carried a burlap sack of supplies. The other reached out to rest gently on the little girl's shoulder. "Papa," Lily whispered, not releasing Mary's hand, but leaning slightly toward him. David Brown studied Mary with a cautious gaze, taking in her trembling form and the carpet bag at her feet. His face revealed little, weathered by sun and wind into a mask of careful neutrality. Yet there was no hostility at his expression as he offered a slight nod of acknowledgement. "I'm sorry if she's bothering you, ma'am," he said, his voice like gravel underfoot, rough but steady. "She tends to wander when I'm settling accounts at the mercantile." Mary straightened her back, suddenly aware of her tear-stained cheeks and disheveled appearance. She smoothed her skirt with one hand, the other still clasped in Lily's mitten. "She's no bother," Mary managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt. "She's very kind." The rancher's eyes flickered briefly to the letter still clutched in Mary's hand, then back to her face. Something in his expression shifted, perhaps recognition of her distress or simple human concern for a stranger alone at dusk. "Come along now, Lily," he said, his tone gentler than his appearance suggested. "We need to head home before dark." Lily looked up at Mary, her small face solemn beneath her oversized hat. "Bye," she whispered, reluctantly releasing Mary's hand. As they turned to leave, Mary watched them, father and daughter, walking away across the platform, 2 figures against the fading light of the Montana evening, leaving her alone once more with her battered bag and broken hopes. "I'm sorry. She's got a soft heart," the man said, his voice gruff but not unkind. His weathered face showed signs of hard work and worry. though his eyes softened when they fell on the little girl. Mary Johnson stood quickly, brushing invisible dust from her travel-worn skirt. The sudden appearance of this stranger, tall and broad-shouldered with a quiet intensity, left her flustered. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, conscious of how disheveled she must look after her journey. "She shouldn't bother strangers," he continued, placing a protective hand on the child's shoulder. "Lily tends to speak her mind." The little girl, Lily, didn't seem bothered by her father's gentle admonishment. She continued staring up at Mary, with those wide, hopeful eyes that had asked such an impossible question moments before. "She wasn't bothering me," Mary assured him, her voice steadier than she felt. The platform had emptied now, leaving just the three of them, surrounded by the growing chill of the Montana evening. The man's gaze drifted to the crumpled paper clutched in Mary's gloved hand. The letter that had brought her all this way, full of promises that now seemed like cruel jokes. "You waiting on someone?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. The words tasted bitter on her tongue. Another rejection to add to her collection, another reminder that she didn't belong. The man's jaw tensed, a flicker of something, anger perhaps, crossing his features. Not directed at her, she realized, but at whoever had left her stranded. "Robert Smith?" he asked quietly. Mary's eyes widened in surprise. "You know him?" Before he could answer, Lily tugged insistently at his patched coat, her small face turned up toward him. "Papa," she whispered, though loud enough for Mary to hear. "She's sad. Can we help her?" The father looked down at his daughter, then back at Mary. Something unspoken passed between the adults. An understanding of vulnerability, of being at the mercy of circumstances beyond control. "David Brown," he finally said, offering his name instead of his hand. "And you've already met my daughter." Mary nodded, uncertain what this introduction meant or where it might lead. But as the wind picked up around them, she found herself hoping, against all experience, that perhaps this time rejection wouldn't be the end of her story. David Brown studied Mary's face, noticing the weariness etched in the lines around her eyes. The rancher had seen that look before, the hollow gaze of someone with nowhere to turn. His weathered hands adjusted Lily's coat as he considered what to do with this stranger who had so quickly captured his daughter's attention. "You've got no place to stay?" he asked, his voice low enough that passing townsfolk wouldn't hear. The last thing Mary needed was more gossip following her through Billings. Mary straightened her shoulders, summoning what little dignity remained after the day's humiliation. "I'll manage," she began, but her voice lacked conviction. The bookkeeper glanced down at her carpet bag, which contained everything she owned in the world, a few dresses, a hairbrush, and the remnants of dreams that had brought her to Montana. "It's cold out," David said, looking toward the darkening sky, where heavy clouds threatened snow. "If you want a roof and some broth, you're welcome for dinner." His offer was simple, practical, the way of survival he'd learned since Anna's passing. Lily still clung to Mary's gloved hand, her small fingers wrapped tightly around Mary's, as if afraid she might disappear. The child looked up at her father with pleading eyes, silently begging him not to separate her from this woman who had shown her kindness. Mary hesitated, weighing her options. The station would close soon. The boarding house would ask questions she couldn't bear to answer. And the chill in the air promised a bitter night ahead. "I don't want to impose," she whispered, her Pawnee heritage having taught her the pain of unwelcome presence. David shook his head. "It's just dinner," he clarified, not wanting to give false impressions. "Lily and I don't have much, but there's enough to share." A gust of wind swept across the platform, carrying the scent of pine and approaching snow. Mary pulled her thin coat tighter, the prospect of warmth and food momentarily overwhelming her pride. "Thank you," she finally said, nodding her acceptance. Relief flooded through her tired body, not just for the shelter, but for the small reprieve from deciding what to do next. The widower picked up his sack of supplies with one hand, while his daughter maintained her grip on Mary. Together, they formed an unlikely trio as they left the station, the little girl between them like a bridge connecting two lonely shores. Mary followed David's steady stride, desperate for warmth and a moment's peace. Behind them, the train station grew quiet as the last passengers dispersed, leaving only the echo of promises unkept and the fading hope of what might have been. The winding path stretched through pine and brush, each step taking Mary Johnson further from the train station and deeper into the Montana wilderness. Lily skipped ahead, occasionally turning back to make sure Mary was still following, her small mittened hand reaching out whenever the terrain grew uneven. David Brown walked a few paces ahead, his broad shoulders hunched slightly against the autumn chill. "Almost there," the rancher called over his shoulder, his voice carried away by the wind that rustled through the trees. As they crested a small hill, a cabin came into view, nestled in a hollow like a bird's nest cradled in the landscape. Smoke curled from the stone chimney in lazy spirals, and the last light of dusk painted the sky in shades of violet and amber. The modest dwelling stood as a testament to hard work and resilience, much like its owner. "Come on!" Lily tugged at Mary's skirts, her excitement palpable. "It's warm inside," she whispered conspiratorially as her father pushed open the wooden door. The cabin's interior greeted them with the welcoming crackle of a fire burning in the hearth. Flames cast dancing shadows across worn plank walls that had weathered many seasons. Mary's eyes adjusted to the dim light, taking in the sparse furnishings. One bed pushed against the far wall, a sturdy wooden table flanked by three mismatched chairs, and a rocking chair positioned near the fireplace. Despite its simplicity, the space was meticulously clean and surprisingly inviting. "You can hang your coat there," David gestured toward a row of pegs beside the door, where a small jacket and a larger one already hung. His movements were efficient, practiced, a man accustomed to managing alone. Mary removed her gloves and unbuttoned her coat, feeling the pleasant warmth begin to thaw her chilled fingers. Lily watched her with undisguised fascination, as if Mary were some exotic creature who had wandered into their lives. David cleared his throat, drawing Mary's attention. His expression was guarded but not unkind as he spoke. "I didn't invite you here to stay forever," he said quietly, his voice low enough that Lily, now investigating something under the table, couldn't hear. "Just for tonight." The clarification stung, though Mary understood its necessity. She nodded, forcing a small smile. "Of course, I'm grateful for even that much." For a moment, they stood in awkward silence. Two strangers brought together by circumstance and a little girl's impulsive kindness. The fire popped loudly in the grate, and outside the Montana night settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. Mary's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but there was something refreshing about David Brown's straightforward manner. No false promises, no hidden intentions, just plain honesty in a world that had shown her little of it. "I didn't invite you to stay forever," he had said, and strangely those words brought her more comfort than empty promises ever could. As David stirred a pot of stew over the crackling fire, the wooden spoon scraping rhythmically against the iron, he glanced at her with those tired eyes. "For the record, I didn't write you any letters," he admitted quietly. Mary felt her stomach drop, though part of her had suspected as much. Another trick, another disappointment to add to her collection. The letter she traveled hundreds of miles for, the one promising a new beginning, a chance at family, was nothing but a cruel joke. "You're not Robert Smith?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Her fingers twisted the worn fabric of her skirt, a habit from childhood that surfaced whenever humiliation threatened to overwhelm her. David shook his head, ladling the steaming stew into three mismatched owls. "Robert's a teenage stable hand at the livery, thinks himself quite the comedian." His jaw tightened visibly. "He likes to meddle with strangers' mail. Not the first time he's pulled this trick." The truth stung like a physical blow. Mary had spent her last savings on the train ticket to Billings, believing someone had finally chosen her. She'd imagined a future where her mixed heritage wouldn't matter, where she might be valued for her bookkeeping skills and gentle nature. "I'm sorry," David said, not meeting her eyes as he placed a bowl before her. "Folks around here can be cruel to outsiders." Little Lily climbed onto the bench beside Mary, her small body radiating warmth. "I like your hair," the child whispered, reaching up to touch a loose strand that had escaped Mary's pins. "It's pretty, like the night." Mary swallowed hard, fighting back tears. She'd been rejected for her Pawnee blood more times than she could count, yet this child saw only beauty where others had seen shame. "Thank you, little one," she whispered. David watched the exchange silently, something unreadable passing across his weathered face. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls, but inside, the fire cast dancing shadows across the small room, and the aroma of herbs and meat filled the air. Mary took a spoonful of the simple stew, letting its warmth spread through her chest. Perhaps it wasn't the welcome she'd hoped for, but for tonight at least, she wasn't alone in the cold. They ate in near silence. The only sound filling the small cabin was Lily Brown's cheerful chatter about her wooden doll and the birds she'd seen that morning. Mary Johnson savored each spoonful of the simple stew, its warmth spreading through her body after the long, disappointing day at the train station. David sat across from them, his shoulders hunched slightly as he watched his daughter's animated gestures, with tired eyes that occasionally drifted to their unexpected guest. "The rabbit told me secrets," Lily announced between bites, her imagination vibrant despite their humble surroundings. "He said good people come when you're sad." Mary smiled gently at the child, touched by her innocent wisdom. When the meal ended, she rose to gather the wooden bowls. Grateful for the hospitality, but unwilling to impose further. "I should find my way back to town," she said softly, reaching for her worn carpet bag. Before she could move toward the door, Lily latched onto her skirts with surprising strength for such a small child. Her wide eyes looked up imploringly at Mary. "This can be your house just for a little," the girl pleaded, her fingers tightening in the fabric. "Please don't go away." David watched the scene unfold, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. The rancher seemed to wage an internal battle before finally relenting with a sigh that carried the weight of his caution. "You can take the cot," he offered, gesturing to the small bed in the corner. "I'll stay up by the fire." His voice was gruff but not unkind. "It's too dark to be wandering back to town anyway." Relief washed over Lily's face as she released Mary's skirt and clapped her mittened hands together. As Mary settled onto the cot, wrapping herself in the offered blanket that smelled of pine and wood smoke, her gaze was drawn to a small dress hanging in the corner. The garment was lovingly hand-beaded in intricate patterns that spoke of skilled craftsmanship and deep cultural meaning. Beside it, a simple wooden shelf held several eagle feathers and a bundle of dried sage tied with sinew, items Mary recognized from her own heritage. The display stood like a shrine, a quiet tribute to someone deeply loved and painfully lost. Mary felt her throat tighten with understanding. This modest cabin held more than just the father and daughter who had welcomed her. It contained the lingering presence of someone whose absence shaped their every day. David caught her looking and turned away quickly, busying himself with banking the fire for the night. Lily had already curled up on her father's larger bed, her small form barely making a bump under the quilt. In the soft glow of the dying embers, the three strangers shared a space that felt, for the first time that day, like it might possibly become a shelter for Mary's wounded heart. Mary's fingers traced the intricate beadwork on the small dress hanging in the corner. The craftsmanship spoke of love and heritage, something familiar that stirred memories of her own mother's hands at work. "She was Pawnee?" Mary asked softly, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. David Brown stood by the window, his broad shoulders tense as he gazed into the darkness outside. "Yes," he answered, his voice rough with emotion. "My wife Anna died last winter. Fever took her in 3 days." He paused, swallowing hard. Nothing I could do. A heavy silence fell between them, filled with shared understanding. Mary knew the weight of loss. Though different from his, grief recognized grief. She watched as he moved to check on Lily, who slept peacefully on the small bed, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. "She looks like her mother," David whispered, gently tucking the blanket around his daughter. "Same spirit too, fearless, kind." Mary nodded, not wanting to intrude on his memories. She gathered her shawl, preparing to find a corner to settle in for the night, when David cleared his throat. "You can stay a few days," he offered unexpectedly, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Lily sleeps better when you're here. Haven't seen her take to anyone like this since—" He trailed off, the unspoken name hanging in the air. "I don't want to impose," Mary replied, though the thought of returning to the cold emptiness of the train station made her heart sink. "It's not imposing if it's offered," David said simply, moving to stoke the fire. "The cot's yours if you want it." Mary nodded, not daring to hope for more than temporary shelter. She'd learned that lesson too many times before. Yet as she settled onto the cot, listening to the gentle breathing of Lily and the occasional creak of the chair where David kept watch, the cabin felt different, warmer somehow, and less lonely. Outside, the Montana wind howled against the walls, but it couldn't penetrate the fragile sense of peace that had settled within. Mary pulled the blanket closer, watching the firelight dance across the ceiling. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like an outsider looking in. Something new had kindled in this small home, something tentative and unspoken, but real nonetheless. As sleep finally claimed her, Mary's last thought was of the beaded dress and the woman who'd made it, wondering if perhaps Anna had somehow guided her here, to this place where a little girl needed a mother and a broken man needed healing. The next morning, Mary Johnson woke to the sound of soft whimpering. Lily was curled up in her small bed, her face flushed crimson against the rough cotton pillowcase. When Mary touched the child's forehead, her skin burned like the cook stove after a long day's use. "David," she called, her voice tight with worry. "Come quick!" David Brown rushed in from where he'd been chopping wood, his face draining of color when he saw his daughter. He gathered Lily in his strong arms, but his hands trembled as he tried to cool her with damp cloths. "She was fine last night," he whispered, voice cracking. "Just like Anna. It started the same way." Mary saw the terror in his eyes, the memory of his wife's death still raw. She placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "I can help," she said firmly. "My father taught me the old ways." Without waiting for permission, Mary unpacked her carpet bag, retrieving small cloth pouches of dried herbs and roots she'd carried across the country. These remedies had been her mother's legacy, knowledge passed down through generations of Pawnee women. "Boil water," she instructed, her fingers working quickly to measure portions. "And bring me clean cloths." David moved like a man in a dream, following her directions while keeping his eyes fixed on Lily's labored breathing. The little girl's chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, her small body fighting against the fever's grip. Mary crushed bitter roots between two stones, mixing them with honey to make them palatable. She brewed a strong-smelling tea and soaked poultices in a separate bowl. "This will draw out the heat," she explained, placing the warm herbs against Lily's chest and feet. "The tea will fight what's inside her." David watched, helpless, as Mary coaxed his daughter to swallow tiny sips of the bitter liquid. His broad shoulders hunched forward, hands clasped as if in prayer. "What if it doesn't work?" he asked, voice barely audible. Mary met his gaze, seeing the depths of his fear. "Then we try something else," she answered. "But I won't give up." Throughout the morning, she bathed Lily's burning skin with cool water, singing soft Pawnee healing songs under her breath. The cabin filled with the earthy scent of medicine and the quiet determination of a woman fighting for a child who just days ago had been a stranger. David remained beside them, passing cloths, stoking the fire, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. In those desperate hours, something shifted between them. Trust born of necessity, hope kindled in shared fear. "Thank you," he whispered as Lily's breathing finally steadied. "I couldn't have." Mary silenced him with a gentle shake of her head. "She's not out of danger yet," she said softly, "but we'll watch over her together." Throughout the night, Mary Johnson maintained her vigil by Lily's bedside, her movements precise yet gentle as she tended to the feverish child. She wrung out cool cloths and placed them on the little girl's burning forehead, her fingers working with practiced efficiency. The cabin's interior had grown dim, illuminated only by the flickering glow of the dying fire and a single lantern that cast long shadows across the wooden walls. "Drink a little more, sweetheart," Mary coaxed, supporting Lily's head as she brought a cup of bitter herbal tea to her parched lips. The child whimpered, turning away from the unpleasant taste. "I know it's not sweet, but it will help the fever leave your body," she whispered, her voice a soothing melody in the quiet room. David sat nearby, his broad shoulders hunched forward, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Every labored breath from his daughter seemed to physically pain him. He watched Mary work with a mixture of desperation and wonder, his tired eyes never leaving the pair. "My mother taught me these remedies," Mary explained softly as she prepared another poultice from the roots she carried in her carpet bag. "The Pawnee have known these healing ways for generations." Her heritage, so often a source of rejection, now flowed through her hands as medicine. When Lily cried out, delirious with fever, David moved instinctively toward her, but stopped, uncertain. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Talk to her," Mary advised. "Let her hear your voice. It anchors her." The rancher leaned close to his daughter, whispering stories about her mother, about the horses in spring, about the wildflowers that would soon bloom. His deep voice trembled occasionally, betraying the fear he fought to contain. As midnight passed and the hours stretched toward dawn, Mary sang softly, old songs that carried the rhythm of her mother's people, lullabies that seemed to calm the child's restless movements. David watched her, memorizing each gesture, each tender touch that Mary bestowed upon Lily as if she were her own. "I've seen fever take too many," Mary admitted during the darkest hour of night. "But she's strong, like you." Her eyes met David's across the small bed, and something unspoken passed between them, a shared determination that death would not claim this child. The fire had dwindled to embers when Lily's breathing finally eased. Mary placed her palm on the girl's forehead and closed her eyes in silent gratitude. "The fever's breaking," she announced, her voice barely audible. David released a shuddering breath, tears gathering in his eyes as he reached for his daughter's small hand. Outside, the first pale light of dawn crept across the Montana sky, bringing with it the promise of another day, and for the three souls in the cabin, the fragile hope of tomorrow. The first rays of morning light filtered through the frost-covered window as Lily's eyelids fluttered open. Her small body, still weak from the fever that had nearly claimed her, stirred beneath the patchwork quilt. Mary Johnson sat beside the child, her vigilant watch unbroken through the night, fingers cramped from wringing out cool cloths for the little girl's forehead. "Mommy," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible as her tiny hand reached out blindly, searching the air until it found Mary's work-worn fingers. The word hung in the cabin's still air. Mary's breath caught in her throat, her eyes immediately darting to David Brown, who stood frozen by the hearth. His broad shoulders tensed, and his tired eyes widened with a mixture of shock and profound gratitude. The rancher's weathered face displayed emotions he couldn't hide. Fear for his daughter's life, now giving way to something more complex. Mary remained motionless, unsure how to respond to the child's innocent claim. She wasn't Lily's mother. She was just a stranger who'd arrived days ago with nothing but a carpet bag and shattered dreams. Yet in this moment, the word felt both terrifying and right, like a key sliding into a lock she hadn't known existed. Mary began, but words failed her. David moved across the wooden floor, his steps deliberate as he knelt beside the small bed. "She knows what feels safe," he said, his voice rough with emotion. His calloused hand gently brushed a strand of hair from his daughter's feverish brow. "Children have wisdom we forget as we grow old." Lily's eyes drifted between the two adults, her small face peaceful despite her illness. "Stay," she murmured, her fingers tightening around Mary's hand. The three of them sat in a silence broken only by the occasional pop from the dying embers in the fireplace. Outside, frost clung to the windows like delicate lace, sealing them in this moment together. The cabin, which had felt so empty to David since Anna's passing, now seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls were witnessing something precious taking shape. Mary swallowed hard, feeling tears threaten. She'd spent years being unwanted, rejected for her mixed heritage, abandoned by those who'd promised to care. Now this child, this perfect, innocent child, had chosen her without hesitation. David's eyes met Mary's across Lily's small form, and something unspoken passed between them, a fragile, tentative bond forming in the wake of shared concern and relief. Not love, not yet, but perhaps its beginning. Mutual respect and gratitude, the foundation of something that might, with time and care, grow into belonging. The days passed with new gentleness as winter settled over the Montana countryside. Mary Johnson found purpose in the small cabin, her nimble fingers working through the evenings to mend Lily's worn dresses. She added delicate stitches to frayed hems and patched tiny elbows with scraps of fabric saved from Anna's sewing basket. "My mama used to sing while she worked," Lily announced one evening, watching Mary's hands move steadily by lamplight. Mary smiled softly. "Would you like me to sing for you?" When the child nodded eagerly, Mary began humming Pawnee lullabies her own mother had taught her, songs of stars and prairie winds that had comforted her through lonely nights. Soon, Lily was learning the melodies, her small voice joining Mary's in sweet harmony. The cabin, once shrouded in grief, gradually filled with laughter. Mary taught Lily to make cornhusk dolls and told stories of clever rabbits outsmarting wolves, tales that bridged her two heritages. David would pause in his work, listening from the doorway, his weathered face softening at the sound of his daughter's giggles. "I haven't heard her laugh like that since before Anna fell ill," he confessed one night after Lily had fallen asleep. The fire crackled between them, casting warm shadows across the plank walls. David watched Mary with quiet awe. His daughter blossomed in her presence, becoming chatty and curious again. The rancher found himself sharing memories he'd locked away, how he'd met Anna at a harvest dance, her skill with beadwork, the dreams they'd had for their little homestead. "She wanted more children," he said, voice rough with emotion. "We'd planned for a houseful." Mary listened without judgment, recognizing the healing in his words. She understood loss, had carried it her whole life, but here, in this humble cabin, something was mending in all of them. "Anna would be grateful," Mary said carefully, "that Lily has someone to teach her the Pawnee ways." David nodded, his eyes reflecting firelight. She worried about that. That part of Lily would be lost without her. Slowly, he let his guard down, sharing stories of the life they'd built. The first winter in the cabin, with walls that barely kept out the wind. The spring they'd planted apple trees that had yet to bear fruit. The day Lily was born, during a thunderstorm. As January snow piled against the cabin walls, Mary realized she was no longer counting days until departure. For the first time in her life, she wasn't planning her next escape. Instead, she found herself imagining springs and summers in this place, watching Lily grow tall and strong under the Montana sky. The late afternoon sun slanted through the cabin window as Mary Johnson sat at the table, mending one of Lily's dresses. David had built a fire against the growing chill, and as the flames crackled, something in Mary loosened. Words she'd held inside for years suddenly needed air. "I was left at the altar twice," she said quietly, her fingers still working the needle. The first man claimed he couldn't marry someone with Indian blood. The second simply didn't show. She paused, the memory still raw. "The whole town watched me wait in my borrowed dress." David looked up from where he was carving a small wooden horse for Lily, his hands stilling. He didn't interrupt, just nodded for her to continue. "My mother died when I was 12, Mary went on. "My father's people never accepted me, and my mother's tribe saw me as an outsider. I've been unwanted everywhere." Her voice remained steady, though her fingers trembled slightly. "I became a bookkeeper because numbers don't care about your heritage." The rancher set his carving down, his face solemn in the firelight. "People can be cruel without even trying," he said. Mary nodded. "The letter that brought me here, it wasn't the first time I believed someone might want me. I should have known better." "I'm glad you came," David said simply. He rose and added wood to the fire, then settled back in his chair. "Anna was killed by 3 men who thought stealing horses from a man who married a Pawnee woman was justified." His voice was low, ensuring Lily wouldn't hear from where she played in the corner. "I found her by the creek. She'd fought hard." Mary's breath caught. She reached across the table, her fingers stopping just short of his. "I couldn't protect her," he continued. "Every day I fear I'll fail Lily the same way." "You haven't failed her," Mary whispered. David's eyes met hers. "For months after I just existed, kept Lily fed, kept the cabin warm, nothing more." Outside, snow began to fall, soft and silent against the window. Inside, the distance between them seemed to shrink with each shared truth. "I understand survival," Mary said. "It's all I've done my whole life." "Maybe there's more than just surviving," David replied, his voice rough with emotion. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Mary felt truly seen. Not as a half-breed, not as a woman desperate for marriage, but as herself, with all her scars and strengths. David didn't look away from her pain or judge her for it. Instead, he offered his own broken pieces, as if to say, "Here, these fit with yours." "Maybe there is," she agreed softly, and the hope in her voice was new and fragile. The winter deepened, blanketing the Montana countryside in pristine white. Inside David Brown's cabin, the transformation was just as profound, but infinitely warmer. Mary Johnson had become essential to their small family, her presence filling empty corners with quiet purpose. Each evening, as she taught Lily to sew or told stories of Pawnee ancestors, David watched with a softness in his eyes that spoke volumes. One bitter afternoon, as Mary kneaded dough for bread, she realized the cabin had grown too quiet. "Lily?" she called, dusting flour from her hands. No answer came. David had gone to repair a neighbor's fence, leaving them alone. A cold dread settled in Mary's stomach as she searched each corner of their small home. Near the door, she found it. Lily's coat missing from its peg. Mary's heart hammered against her ribs as she threw on her shawl and burst outside. The wind bit through her thin clothes, but panic drove her forward. Small footprints marked the snow, wandering toward the frozen creek that cut through their property. "Lily!" Mary screamed, her voice carried away by the howling wind. Following the tiny tracks, she ran until her lungs burned with cold. At the creek's edge, the footprints stopped, and there was Lily, a small huddled form on a patch of ice that had cracked beneath her weight. The child was clinging to a branch, half submerged in the frigid water. "Don't move, sweetheart," Mary called, her mind racing. The ice wouldn't hold her weight. Without hesitation, she waded into the freezing current, gasping as water soaked her skirts and the cold stabbed like knives. Lily's lips had turned blue, her small fingers losing their grip. Mary pushed forward, ignoring the numbness creeping up her legs. "Hold on, just a little longer," she pleaded, stretching her arms toward the child. When her fingers finally closed around Lily's coat, Mary pulled her close, shielding the little girl with her body as they struggled toward shore. The sound of running footsteps cut through the wind. David appeared at the bank, his face ashen with terror. He rushed into the water, lifting both of them in his strong arms and carrying them toward home. I saw a bird, Papa," Lily whispered through chattering teeth. "I wanted to show Mary." David's eyes met Mary's over Lily's head, his gaze filled with gratitude and fear. Mary felt consciousness slipping away as cold penetrated her bones. The last thing she remembered was David's voice, rough with emotion. "Stay with us, Mary. Please stay." As darkness claimed her, Mary realized she had never hesitated, not for a moment. She would give her life for this child, who had asked her to be a mother. For the first time, Mary understood what it meant to truly belong. The cabin creaked under the weight of winter as David Brown knelt beside the cot, his calloused hands trembling as he tucked another blanket around Mary's shivering form. Her skin remained pale as moonlight, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air despite the roaring fire he'd built. The terror of watching her plunge into the icy creek to save Lily still gripped his chest like a vice. "You need to drink this," he urged, supporting her head as he pressed a steaming cup of willow bark tea to her lips. Mary swallowed weakly, her eyes fluttering open for just moments before closing again. David hadn't left her side since carrying her dripping and unconscious from the creek, his heart hammering with a fear he hadn't felt since Anna's final days. Throughout the night, he changed the warm stones wrapped in cloth at her feet, whispered prayers into the darkness, and watched for each breath. Lily had finally fallen asleep in her small bed after hours of tearful vigil, her small hand clutching Mary's skirt even in slumber. As the wind howled outside, David found himself speaking aloud, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought I'd lost everything when Anna died," he confessed to the semi-conscious woman. "Didn't think I'd ever feel that kind of fear again." His fingers gently brushed a strand of damp hair from her forehead. "But seeing you in that water..." Mary stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering. David leaned closer, his broad shoulders hunched with exhaustion and worry. "Don't leave us," he whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "Please, Mary, stay." Her eyes opened then, clearer than before, and focused on his face. The rancher held his breath, afraid to hope as color slowly returned to her cheeks. "I wasn't planning to go," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, and David felt something inside him crack open. A wall he'd built after burying his wife. Mary's hand found his, her fingers still cold, but her grip surprisingly strong. In that moment, and as dawn's first light filtered through frost-covered windows, David saw in her eyes what he'd been afraid to acknowledge. She'd become essential to them, not as the stranger who'd arrived on a cold autumn day, but as someone irreplaceable. "You and Lily," Mary whispered. "You're my family now." David nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He squeezed her hand gently, and in that simple gesture was everything he couldn't yet say, that in her he'd found not just a mother for his daughter, but a chance to heal, to hope, to build something new from the ashes of what they'd both lost. Spring arrived in Montana with a gentle thaw, painting the hills in tender greens and wild violets. The transformation outside mirrored the change within the small community as Mary Johnson's presence gradually shifted from curiosity to blessing. The woman who had arrived with nothing but a worn carpet bag had become an essential thread in the fabric of their lives. Each morning, Mary would gather the neighbor children beneath the old oak tree, teaching them their letters in the dirt with a stick. Her patience never wavered, even with the most stubborn learners. "Miss Mary knows things," the children would whisper, watching her fingers trace words that suddenly made sense to them. Word spread about her remedies, too. The teas and poultices that had saved Lily during that frightening fever became sought after by mothers with sickly children and old men with aching joints. Mary would collect herbs at dawn, her knowledge, passed down from her Pawnee mother, finally valued rather than scorned. "She's got the healing touch," Mrs. Peterson declared after Mary's willow bark tea eased her husband's fever. The same townsfolk who had once whispered behind their hands about her heritage now knocked at the cabin door, seeking help and offering eggs or fresh bread in return. David Brown watched this transformation with quiet wonder. The reserved rancher who had barely spoken to neighbors now found himself engaged in conversation, his shoulders less burdened, as he built benches for the schoolhouse and repaired fences for elderly neighbors. His hands, once occupied solely with survival, now created things of beauty: a carved wooden horse for Lily, a shelf for Mary's growing collection of dried herbs. "You've changed him," Mrs. Wilson told Mary one afternoon as they hung laundry. "Haven't seen him smile since Anna passed." Mary simply nodded, unwilling to claim credit for the light returning to David's eyes. That belonged to time and to Lily's laughter filling their home. The little girl, now healthy and spirited, had blossomed under Mary's care. Lily followed her everywhere, helping to gather eggs and learning to stitch crude flowers onto handkerchiefs. Her attachment was fierce and unconditional, the pure love of a child who had found her mother in an unexpected place. "Mommy, look!" became Lily's constant refrain, whether showing a spotted frog or a crooked row of stitches. Each time she used the word, Mary's heart swelled with gratitude for the child who had first reached for her hand on that lonely train platform. As wildflowers dotted the meadows surrounding their cabin, Mary realized she had finally found what she'd been seeking her entire life. Not just a place to stay, but a place to belong. A year later, the Montana spring painted the landscape with wildflowers and promise. Mary Johnson stood in the field behind their cabin, watching as Lily twirled through the tall grass, her laughter carrying on the breeze. The little girl who had once asked a heartbroken stranger to be her mother now danced with the carefree joy of a child who knew she was deeply loved. There was no church wedding, no preacher to officiate, just the three of them and a handful of neighbors who had journeyed from town. The same people who had once whispered behind Mary's back now arrived bearing handmade quilts, jars of preserves, and genuine smiles. Even old Mrs. Peterson, who had initially regarded Mary with suspicion because of her Pawnee heritage, had baked a special loaf of bread for the occasion. Mary smoothed the simple cotton dress she'd sewn by candlelight over many evenings. The fabric caught the golden light of late afternoon, and her dark hair was braided with a single eagle feather, a tribute to her mother's traditions. She'd never imagined finding acceptance in Billings, let alone love. David approached her, his broad shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't been when they first met. The grief that had once etched deep lines around his eyes had softened, though he would always carry the memory of Anna in his heart. He took Mary's hands in his calloused ones, strong from seasons of working the land. "I choose you, Mary," he said, his voice trembling with emotion that the reserved rancher rarely displayed. "Not just today, but every day." He squeezed her fingers gently. "You brought life back to this home when I thought all hope was gone." Tears welled in Mary's eyes as she remembered the train station where she'd sat abandoned, the cruel laughter of strangers, the lifetime of rejection that had led her to that moment of despair. Now, looking at David's honest face and feeling Lily's small arms wrap around her waist, she knew she'd found what she'd always searched for. "And I choose you both," she whispered back, "with all that I am." Lily looked up, her face bright with joy. "My mommy and daddy!" she shouted to anyone who would listen, then ran to gather wildflowers that she pressed into Mary's hands. The neighbors clapped and cheered as David kissed Mary beneath the vast Montana sky. No church could have been more sacred than this field, where three broken hearts had found each other and become whole again. That evening, as stars appeared above their cabin, Mary rocked Lily to sleep while David stoked the fire. They were no longer three